Hi guys, welcome back to Battle with Ola. This is Mujela Olua. I'm so excited because today I want to talk about humanitarian intervention. If you're very familiar with the channel, you know that I am always so full of joy to talk about my master's thesis because it gave me a great joy to write that thesis. I totally enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed writing my undergraduate thesis too, but this master's thesis was just so lovely. I picked my topic, I wrote the proposal, it was approved 100%, and I wrote the thesis, and then I got a 70, an A grade, exactly 70. I was so happy. Oh, so let's talk about humanitarian intervention today. Humanitarian intervention is a concept in international law, especially the law of conflict and warfare, that allows the United Nations in modern times now. Used to be a state or a group of states, but now it's more vested in the United Nations to intervene in an imploding state to save the citizens of the state from their government. That is how easy that's how you can easily understand it. So I'm going to break it down and explain it. This is basically a summary of my master's thesis to an extent because I'm not going to be talking about everything. I've talked about how I wrote that thesis in a series of videos on the channel already. But today I want to talk about that concept, and hopefully I'm looking forward to doing more research and writing more in the field of international law of conflict and warfare. I really enjoyed, studying this particular field. So now, the United Nations has a responsibility to protect members of the global community from large-scale violations of their fundamental human rights. And the protection is automatic in the sense that they do not need to make an application or do anything. It just arises. It's a burden, a duty on the United Nations to rise up to the occasion. It's a duty on the United Nations to rise up to the occasion to protect members of the global community from large-scale violations of their fundamental human rights. So if there's a sovereign state now that is wherein the government has turned against its people and is violating their human rights, as we had in Libya, in heterogeneous Libya in 2011, where, there was already a parallel government in Libya, and challenging the sovereignty of Muammar Gaddafi's government, and people were dying, there were threats from Gaddafi himself to destroy or to kill those who were against his government, and all that was happening. People were actually dying. The world, the United Nations now could not sit by and watch. They had to rise to the occasion. Now, please keep an open mind because I know that there's a lot of controversy surrounding that Libya intervention, because there have been arguments about the ulterior motives of NATO. There have been arguments about, the Western interest in the rich resources of Libya and so many other things. Anyone can make a case for them, and those things can, be debated. But I'm going to focus on humanitarian intervention, what it is, why. We're going to use the WH questions to understand it. And I'm going to be borrowing a leaf from Muammar Gaddafi's Libya every now and then, because that's what I wrote my master's thesis on. I'm not in support of Western hegemony in African states or in the African region. I'm not in support of colonization. I'm not in support of ulterior motives of Western incentives and aid. Not in support of them at all, but I'm also not in support of violations of humanitarian intervention. I think the greatest argument for any debate on whether the West is good to the African region or not is to ask the African region why it has refused to rise up to the occasion and do well by its own people. African leaders they've dropped the ball continuously. And so if we're saying that the West has done a lot of havoc in the African region, someone even wrote a book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, if that's the correct title. Now, We need to start having conversations about how African leaders are underdeveloping Africa, and in a way collaborating with the West, so to speak, to underdevelop Africa. But I don't want this to turn into a political post. So let's talk about humanitarian intervention stricto sensu. What is humanitarian intervention? What now? Humanitarian intervention, let me read out the definition that was agreed. There was a definition that was agreed at a NATO seminar in Scheveningen in November 1999. It was defined as armed intervention in another state without the agreement of that state to address the threat of humanitarian disaster caused by grave and large-scale violations of fundamental human rights in the state. Essentially, when a state is imploding, and the government has turned against its people, the rest of the world cannot watch, because they have watched in some cases in Somalia and Rwanda, and we saw what happened, irreparable loss and damage. So they have to rise to the occasion to provide humanitarian aid, to provide humanitarian intervention, to stop the abuse of human rights. That's the goal of humanitarian intervention, not to take over the government, not to occupy the region that is distressed in perpetuity, but to stop the violations of human rights. So have at the back of your mind, humanitarian intervention is for protection of human rights. Please also let me say that there's what it is in theory, and there's what it is in practice. Focus on what it is as an ideal now. That's what we want to discuss. And then we can go ahead to compare the ideal with what we actually have, with what we actually have in practical terms. So humanitarian intervention is the interference that is state. Now, I don't want to say love interference, because there are debates around the legality of humanitarian intervention, which I also discussed in my thesis. But essentially, humanitarian intervention is the interference in the sovereignty of another state by a group of other sovereign states, to save the citizens of that sovereign state from its government, from human rights violations and repressions being perpetrated against them by their own government. That is what humanitarian intervention is. It could be unilateral, it could be authorized. When it's authorized, it means that the United Nations actually authorized the intervention, as was the case in Libya 2011. NATO was authorized to intervene in March 2011. It could also be unauthorized. That's when we have unilateral humanitarian intervention. That means that those who are intervening did not wait for United Nations authorization or permission to go into the distressed area to intervene. An example of unilateral humanitarian intervention is NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999. There are so many debates surrounding that intervention as to its legality and the results of the intervention, but essentially some have described it as, a European response to an European problem that is not capable of being replicated in any other part of the world. So that means, or meant, that NATO did not wait for permission, because some members of the United Nations were opposed to forceful intervention, to the use of force, military force. So NATO did not obtain United Nations authorization before invading or intervening in Kosovo in 1999. There are three things to note about humanitarian intervention. You must always bear in mind these three things. They are the most important ingredients that make up humanitarian intervention. The first is that it is not a voluntary action, it is a necessary action. So it is not a case of a state or a group of states or the United Nations waking up and saying, oh, let's intervene in Gambia, let's intervene in Nigeria. No, it is necessary. That means that the repression and the violation of human rights, fundamental rights in those states must have become unignorable, so to speak. They must have become, so terrible, so vast, so far gone that the world cannot watch any longer. So it is necessary, not voluntary. It is not according to the whims and caprices of the United Nations or any other state. That's the first thing. The second thing to note is that it is temporary. So humanitarian intervention does not give any state or group of states or the intervening force the authority or the right to occupy the imploding states in perpetuity. It must be temporary. And that's why NATO had to leave Libya, because they did not have the mandate to occupy Libya or to become a government in Libya, or even to enforce or enthrone a government in Libya. That was not part of their, their mandate. So it is a temporary intervention, not permanent. It is not colonization. It is not occupation as well. It is intervention. Must be temporary in nature. The third thing to note is that the primary goal of humanitarian intervention is to safeguard human rights, to protect and to stop the violation of human rights, to stop the large-scale violation and repression and infringement on fundamental human rights, especially right to life. Right to life, very important, and a host of other lives that are involved, in a country's implosion. Those are the most important three things to note about humanitarian intervention. Now, there's a debate about the use of force in humanitarian intervention. But if some have described humanitarian intervention as being inclusive of humanitarian aid supplies, and non-forceful intervention. But there will be no humanitarian intervention successfully done if there's no use of force, because the government is already using force against its people in most cases. So if you do not meet force with force, it is unlikely that a government will back down from their acts of repression. If a government is killing opposition parties, journalists, people that are rebel forces, if they have joined, in litigation, there's something we talk about when you have joint issues. So if they have joint issues on the battlefield, you cannot bring non-forceful means to successfully, stop those kinds of you cannot in most cases deploy non-forceful means to stop that. So very important. The use of force is necessary. And this debate is surrounding the fact that the UN Charter proscribes the use of force in a sovereign state. Essentially, the UN Charter has already said that if there's a sovereign state, other sovereign states do not have a right to come into that state with force, military force, to do anything whatsoever without the consent of that state. But humanitarian intervention is saying, we don't have your consent, but we're going to come in, and we're coming in with force. So there's a debate around the legality. While the United Nations Charter in Article 2.4 proscribes the use of forceful interference, in the territorial sovereignty of a sovereign state. Essentially, while it is said that another state cannot come in forcefully into another sovereign state without its consent, it provides two exceptions, and the debates have always been around these two exceptions. The exception of where, it is in response to armed attack, or where it is in preservation of international peace and security. Those are the exceptions provided for in Article 42 and Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Those are the exceptions. But if you look at the history of humanitarian intervention, from history, if you look at the intervention in Haiti, in Iraq, in Somalia, you would notice that force has always been used. And if you look at the definition that I read to you, which is what was agreed, and Shivan again, earlier in the video that I read to you, it describes humanitarian intervention as the use of force. So because the United Nations has said that in addressing such situations, states can apply the use of diplomatic measures, economic measures, and other measures, many scholars have argued that humanitarian intervention is unlawful. But if we look at the interventions that have taken place over the years and the results, looking at, especially when we look at what could have happened compared to what happened, you would see that the use of force can be justified and can be agreed upon as being legal. Now, because it's become a practice, we can agree that it is become international law, which is the tradition of the international community, what the international community would usually do in such situations. So it can be argued that it is now lawful, because by definition it is lawful, because it is in preservation of peace, international peace and security, which is the exception provided for in the UN Charter itself, and because by practice, what has been over the years, it has always involved the use of force. So we can argue that humanitarian intervention is legal. The argument subsists. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Look at what happened in Libya and what happened in some other states, in Somalia, in Rwanda, in Iraq, in several other states. Is it Iraq? In several other states. You would notice that usually there has to be crisis on ground before the United Nations can intervene. That crisis must be such that it can no longer be overlooked, because people are dying. Human rights is being disregarded, and this is usually being committed by the government of a sovereign state. As such, that same government will not give permission to the United Nations or any other state or body to come to its people's rescue, because it's essentially the people versus their government. So the UN comes in, as a mediator, and when push comes to shove, they employ forceful means of preserving peace. So if you look at what happened in Libya, some of the things they did was to enforce an arms embargo. If you look at resolutions 1970 and 1973, it kept on emphasizing the sovereignty of Libya and encouraging or calling for peaceful resolutions. But they had to enforce an arms embargo. They had to freeze the assets of officials of some government officials, that were involved in the mass violations of human rights. They also enforced a no-fly zone, and they had to, protect the citizens' lives and property. When you look at these things, the way to understand it is, if humanitarian intervention is so terrible and should not be done, what's the alternative? The alternative is costlier. In the 90s, in 1992, in Rwanda, when the world did not intervene, the genocide recorded over 1 million deaths. If you look at Cambodia, about 2 million people were killed. If you look at the Biafra war in Nigeria, Igbo Nigeria too, it was the Igbos of Nigeria against the government of Nigeria. So many lives were lost. So the alternative of not intervening can be disastrous. That's the first way to understand the importance or the necessity of humanitarian intervention. The second thing to look at is the issue of consent, because consent is basically what gives humanitarian intervention its seemingly illegal flavor. Will a government that is perpetrating such destruction against its own people permit or authorize or consent to a third party intervening? Never. So consent is always going to be a no-no for a perpetrator of violations of human rights. So it becomes a necessary action to protect the people. When we look at the issue of sovereignty too, we look at the fact that, sovereignty connotes, it involves legitimacy, of course, and it connotes, control, complete control over, the affairs of a state without external interference. But if, for instance, in Libya, there's already a parallel government of the interim NTC, and they were already being recognized by some outside forces or outside bodies as also being a legitimate government in Libya. That meant that the government of Libya was now divided into two, and the sovereignty was being broken down. As such, as at the time that the UN came into Libya, we can argue that Libya had already lost its sovereignty, and it was no longer a sovereign state. The government was no longer a sovereign government. It no longer had sole and complete control over the affairs, the internal affairs of Libya, because there was now a parallel government, which is a locally breeded government, not one that was brought from outside. So those are the things that you look at when you want to understand the necessity or legality of humanitarian intervention. What are some of the arguments against humanitarian intervention? One of the most important arguments is that it infringes on the sovereignty of a state. And we have already argued that if sovereignty is already lost at the point of intervention, that is, if there's already a parallel government, then what sovereignty are they really infringing upon? Then we've looked at another argument, against it is that it would seem as though the intervener is coming in to support one faction. And now look at it. If, for instance, in a place like Libya, where the people are heterogeneous, many tribes and tongues, and are not homogeneous, and there's a government and there's a population that perceives the government to be serving the interest of one region or one tribe or one tongue, and now they have formed their own coalition or their parallel government, and they are the ones calling for help. And now when the United Nations comes in, they are agreeing or cooperating with the United Nations, saying, please stop, help us, don't let our government kill us. And the government perpetrating the destruction has refused to come to table, despite the fact that the resolutions 1970 and 1973 continue to call for peaceful resolutions and to restate the sovereignty of the government of Libya. They refuse to come to table. The party that comes to table, the party that cooperates with peaceful with means or with efforts to restore peace and security, it will look as if whoever is intervening is in support of that party. So there's a bias that you can look at it from that, they came to defend the interest of one faction and not the interest of the general populace. Also, you look at it in the sense that if there's an intervention, it should not be permanent, yes, but if the intervention comes in and then causes a regime change like that of Libya, we begin to consider, was this the real goal of the intervention, to usurp the government, to bring in a puppet government, and to take out the government that can resist possibly Western domination? That's also a consideration. Another consideration is to look at post-conflict states. What happens when you look at Libya, when you look at some of these states, they have continued in a near conflict or remained in a conflict situation even after the intervention, because it's not permanent. Boots have left the ground, strikes have stopped and all of that, but the conflict situation continues locally, and the country becomes a shadow of its former self. So one could also argue that, what's the purpose of this intervention to start with? Was there an ulterior motive, to remove the government in power and to put in a puppet and to destroy the state and make it a shadow of its former self? So these are some of the considerations against humanitarian intervention. But I would argue that the pros outweigh the cons. So when you look at lives that are lost, lives are that's irreparable loss. And so if there's a third party coming in and saying we are representing the international community to which you belong, and since your government has refused to protect you, because that's the primary aim and the primary duty of any government across the world, it is enshrined in most constitutions that the government will protect and secure the welfare of its people. So if the government is no longer doing that, you cease to become temporarily citizens of that state alone. You become global citizens, and now it is the responsibility of the whole world, represented by the cloak, under the cloak rather of the United Nations, to look after you as global citizens. So that's essentially what humanitarian intervention is about. I hope that you have a fair idea of what it is now. There are so many arguments for and against, but when you weigh the pros and cons, you're able to decide if a particular intervention was worth it and if humanitarian intervention is something that should continue. If you ask me, I would say that it should continue. We hope and we pray that the world continues to know peace, but in conflict situations, humanitarian interventions must be an option, but we must faction out, a modus operandi. It should not just be a thing that, when it's happening, then we now decide what we want to do, pass a resolution. We should canonize humanitarian intervention. Let there be criteria, that must be ticked before humanitarian intervention can arise. When it arises, let there be, things that must, action points that must be carried out, limits that must be respected, and goals, focuses that must be achieved, by the intervention. And then let there be post-intervention management such that countries are not worse off than when they started or before the intervention. Those are some of the things that can be used to stabilize and to standardize, the concept and the execution of humanitarian interventions. I hope you have learned a thing or two. I will see you in my very next video. Don't forget to subscribe. Leave comments in the comment section. Toodles.